So I finished up working on my Museum of Environmental Storytelling, and I figured this would be a good part two to describe the additional exhibits I've added. One of the things I did add is these little headphones that appear at various places in the museum, and if you hover over them or touch them, then there's an audio clip where I describe what the presentation is. It seemed easier than my trying to type paragraphs of information for each exhibit. So we saw this last time. This is the room full of all the balance examples, and then it goes into this room, and this is one of those concepts of environmental storytelling I think are really, really important, which is the power of the threshold or the power of the doorway. And in this room, I've just got a big empty room with the doorway in it, and then on the other side of the doorway, the color changes, the temperature changes, and there's also an audio effect, I think, that gives you a sense that you're in another space. But the power of the threshold or the doorway is that it symbolizes that something has changed when you've gone through it. And even the act of going through this doorway in this big empty room is to feel as though you've left one area and you've gone into another. And so when you're designing theme park attractions or virtual attractions, think about the best way to create the departure from one space into another space. And there's even now a scientific term, I think it's called the doorway effect, which basically states that if you're in the living room watching television, you decide to have popcorn, the act of walking into the kitchen, you might actually forget why you're in the kitchen because the concept of popcorn actually lives in the living room where the television is, and you have forgotten it because of the act of walking from one space to the other. So think about, as you're designing, what are the opportunities of a doorway. Even as silly and simple as, walking around this doorway feels very different than walking through the doorway. So doorways are great and should be used, and thresholds whenever possible. This little exhibit here is to talk about something that I ran when I was doing video games, which was, even though we had very few polygons to work with, I felt strongly that you could create a sense of life and things being alive by how you arrange them. So here on the left is a very symmetrical arrangement of very rather boring pieces of furniture to describe two tables, a stool, a table, two chairs, a stool, and some bottles and a book. Over here are all the same elements, except I've sort of fattened up the pieces. I've given them some personality. The chairs are actually slightly different, one from the other. And then I've also sort of skewed everything, and I have suggested that something's happening, that someone's reading a book, that a bottle has been opened, and that even the table is off a little bit. So if you're really into symmetry, then probably this is your preferred display. But if you're trying to imbue your environment with life, even with as few polygons as this is one way in which you can suggest that someone has been here, that there is a story happening, even if you don't list out what that story is. And also in the realm of sort of appeal and charm and adding life, over here to the left are two examples of figures when you're talking about characters. And the one on the left is sort of normal proportions of a human, and the one on the right is more sort of exaggerated, I'd call it Mickey Mouse proportions. The advantage to that is that there's an approachability that is sort of built into our brain based upon our dealing with things like babies and kittens. And this proportion, although it works with characters really well, can also work really well for even furniture. So if I go back over here, if you look at the difference between the table on the left and the tables on the right, there's a bit of charm, there's a fatness to it that is similar to the way in which those characters are depicted. That there's an approachability that one could argue might be cartoony, but it also makes this feel comfortable and safe. Well, this feels a little bit cold and stark. The same can be true of these two figures. The one on the right feels approachable. The one on the left is okay, but it is not nearly as charming and appealing as the one on the right. Doesn't suggest that everything you make should be the proportions of Mickey Mouse, but it does suggest that there's opportunities there that you could think about. Over here in this exhibit, there are actually two elements, and this is the idea of working with vignettes. So one on the left and one on the right. And by thinking in vignettes, and I think of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland as a perfect example, any place that you're not looking, they haven't themed. It's just a blank black wall. So you can actually really minimize the amount of detail you put into an environment by really focusing graphically through the light, through the color choices, a vignette that could tell a story. So this one here, I don't know what the story is, but there is a phone. It's slightly off the hook. There's a notepad, and then there's this sort of graphic light that we don't have beams of light in Horizon, so I'm just using graphic shapes to suggest lighting. I've even made a shape underneath it to suggest that the table's casting a shadow on the floor, but that's actually geometry. The same is true over here. I've done the same thing, except the light source is coming from this fireplace, and the shadow is just geometry again of a duplicate of the stool. But in this area, whatever the story may be, there is no doubt that what you're focusing on is that knife. And the reason why you're focusing on it is because as a designer, I've arranged the pieces so that your eye would lead to it, and it would suggest a level of importance on that knife that would suggest that there's a story, there's something going on. So when you're designing places, whether it's a theme park or a game or something in the virtual world, these simple tasks, these simple design principles can really, really work, even despite the limited polygons you have, of telling an evocative story, even within these limitations. And then finally over here, the last one is talking about composition. So the arrangement of all these pieces are meant to help you as a designer focus the attention of your audience so that they go and look at the thing you want them to look at. So in this example, I've got this sort of medieval sort of Arthurian knight coffin, stone coffin, but I want you to look at it. So the way that I've done that is I've arranged all the pieces so that they focus your attention down there, and I even have these sort of static dust mites that are hovering over him that lead your eye down to him. Everything about this room, even though there's a lot to look at, is about having you look at the thing I want you to look at, which is this figure here on the stone. And I've even gone to the trouble to give this importance and suggest the light source. If you look up, you can actually see that the moon is framed above to be shining down here on this figure. So this is the last little exhibit. As I said early on in the previous video, I was trying to see whether or not there was a way with the limited polygons that I have to create a sense of story, a sense of mystery, and a way in which you can sort of add your own tale or story or narrative to this. I'm purely suggesting it, and these tools work in all forms of theater and also in theme parks and games. And so I created just a little exit area here, which leads to the headphones give you a little sort of thank you for coming message, and then there's a link to another one of my projects, which was the Storytelling Sandbox, which is vignettes that use a lot of the principles that I've talked about here in the museum. Anyway, so thanks for following along. It was really, really fun to work on. I think I probably could make 5 more museums with principles I haven't talked about yet. But for me, it proved that there's a lot that can be done with really little. And hopefully this will help other creators working in the virtual world to create really story-driven and evocative spaces, despite whatever the technical limitations or the tools that they have at their disposal. So thank you for coming along.